Just taking a last sip before we go live. Hi, friends. You are back again for another round of AP Gov Review. I'm so excited to see you. It's Friday. We're going into the weekend. Now, I know that, it's this day or that day, but we get to have 2 days of not doing anything organized or scheduled. So I'm excited for that. I hope you are too. So let's get going on today. You know who I am. It's Miss Hitch coming to you live from Northern Virginia out of the school TJ. We're doing some things today. Look, I didn't forget today. We're going to be looking at some primary and quantitative data so that we can think about how powers are exercised with the courts. There's a bunch of stuff that we're using as connections to course content. Let's get right into our MFE corner. So I told you yesterday, I had a minor, actually, I would say it's a major factual error corner because I lied to you. I lied to you. Can you believe it? I can't. Just kidding. I mean, I can because I'm flying at a pace that I really have never in terms of teaching kids. So there was an error on one of the slides on one of the questions I had. I think it was the 1.7 session about concurrent powers. I had told you that the answer was C, and then I probably justified it somehow because I was like, oh, this is the answer. Come up with a reason. I lied. It's D. It's D. And it would make more sense in the context of the course when we talked about being able to have opportunity to have multiple points of influence for policy. So ignore me at that point. Mistakes happen. I want to say thank you to the AP Government Facebook community they're keeping me honest, right? They're back checking me. I don't have an editor, so that's the closest I get to it. All right. Aside from that, I have some great questions from students. Oops, sorry, I'm trying to move something around on my screen here. So some great questions from students about the FRQ we did on Iron Triangle yesterday. And so Iris points out that, is this something we could expect to see on the test because it's in the 5th unit? And so my answer is no, I don't think it'll be on the test because they've said units 1, 2, and 3 are fair game. However, I haven't seen the test, nor will I. So I have no idea what's on there. So let's just say I don't think it will be, right? That's about the extent of it, but it's a great question. And I may start cycling through some content that might come from 4 and 5. As you saw last night's FRQ also kind of dabbled into 4 a little bit because it's stuff that's supposed to come from the entire course. And so while I'm helping you prep for 1 through 3, I'm also trying to make sure that you are able to connect information to those other units that are important and do have critical interactions that we should be able to speak to. So thank you for the question, Iris. The next question comes from, and I don't know the name of the person, so I'm sorry, but at Leply555 on Twitter about the thoughts of using I with the argumentation essay. And so my answer is, and this is a strong preference, I don't prefer it. I advise my students to not talk at all. It's not a conversation. Number one, you would never be using first person, second person, or third person in any type of formal writing that you would do in political science coursework. The issue is applying the data and thinking about the data as it interacts with content, not about necessarily your opinion about it. So we want to avoid that, right? In the amounts of research that I have done working on my own upper level master's coursework, I've never seen, I rarely see an author talk in the third person, whether it be in books or in research publications that go into journals. So it's a great way for you to start prepping for that. We're not talking about opinions, we're talking about drawing conclusions from data. So skip the I. Right? It's assumed that, that you have that's your opinion because you're writing it. The other thing is, I would say stylistically, it also kind of degrades your authority on that subject. By saying it feels like you're having a conversation back and forth, and that takes away kind of, and I'm not saying it does take away. But when I read something where the author is a part of the conversation, I automatically view that as someone's point of view, and I'm a little less willing. I think I have a bias against accepting what they've said because it's coming from them and not drawn conclusions from data, whether it be qualitative or quantitative. And finally, I am reading a book right now where the author talks about themselves in the third person and about the research that they've done. And while this book is an amazing book, and I'm not going to name it, every time the author says the researcher found this, I cringe. Like, I'm like, it's so weird. So just kind of like think about your own experience and how you've read writing. You might see it more in English class where it's appropriate depending on the prompt, but here I would avoid it, is my personal preference. And then today I spent a lot of time going through Twitter. I think I've gotten through, as of 2 o'clock, all of the stuff that had been posted in the past 24 hours. And I was giving kids feedback to get a feel for how we're doing on the concept application. And I noticed that there's 2 students who I'm going to give the cutest students in the world award to, because they are giving their all and giving other students feedback on their work, which I think is just, it's so heartwarming and affirming to see that you guys are building a little community of students who are having these conversations. Granted, it's about skill and content, but I hope that you guys kind of take that, because what we've said, one of the most important parts here, it's not necessarily about applying these concepts in a vacuum. It's about being able to have these conversations rooted in evidence, drawing conclusions from them, and applying them to the real world. So we're having conversations here about FRQs and skills and content application, but don't be afraid to let that evolve into having conversations about the things that are out there. We live in communities that tend to be ideologically homogenous. So this is a great opportunity for us to practice deliberation and listening to each other and hearing it from another human being who's entitled to have an opinion, who's entitled to collect data and draw conclusions from it. And that is one of those things that is more important than the specific skills in this class. It's about learning how to engage others who agree with you and don't agree with you, to see the humanity in them, to have amazing conversations where you're expanding your points of view. You might even find yourself coming into conflict because you're like, oh, hey, that's actually a really good point. And we're not doing the thing where we're going to ad hominems or attacking the person for having that position. Those are all really important skills that is in short order all around right now. Like, a lot of people are speaking from emotion, and we understand that, but it doesn't help us necessarily be able to move the ball forward in coming up with policy solutions that are going to benefit the most. So that's just like my little aside. I'm going to step down off of my soapbox right now, and I'm going to move on to our warm up. So last night I was talking to one of my students. Hello, Raina. And Raina was like, I just am still struggling. Sorry, I hope I'm not throwing you under the bus, my dear, but struggling to see the difference between describe and explain. And I think it's a really great question. When I'm watching other videos that talk about the tasks that you have to do, even mine, when I'm going through it, I'm assuming that you know the difference between these different skills, and they're very different. It's a very different output. So I want to make sure that I slow down for a minute again and come back at this one more time to see if I can come up with a better explanation. So we've got our identify, we've got our define, we've got our describe, we've got our explain. What I've given you there in the second box underneath those terms is I've given you the definition, right? So I'm defining, what does this mean? And then I'm paraphrasing it for you in the white box, where I'm like, this is what this means to me, right? So identify, I'm going to go to the paraphrase, means to name it. So I try to think of something that is something we can all do together, right? And that is, think about a room in your house, because we're all stuck in our houses, right? So the living room is where we're going to start, right? Well, when we identify, we're naming it. Like, we're stepping back and we're saying, this thing, this space, this is a living room, right? We may have to define it so that we're setting a collective understanding that everyone can measure any room in the house by. And so here we're going to say it's a room in residence, and this is from a definition, like a dictionary online. A room in residence used for the common social activities of the occupants. So we can sit there and say, okay, I got it. But when I think about my house, there's several rooms that might fit that bill. As a matter of fact, there's what I would classify as a living room. There's the room that I'm in right now, which you can't see, but it's a real room where there's couches and things going on here. And then I have a porch where we also might use it for common social activities and occupants. So I'd have to sit there and think, okay, like if I'm thinking of what I traditionally assume is my living room, I'm going to have to take that definition and think about it and describe what I see, right? So if I'm thinking of giving representation to a subject, the living room, I want to tell you it looks, it works, it behaves like this. And I should be able to list off attributes that help me to define it as distinctive, right? So my living room has 2 brown couches, a television on the wall, wooden floors, a rug, and a fireplace, which is a little bit different from the other rooms in my house that I might say could be used for common social activities. The room that I'm in also has a couch, also has a television, has this beautiful bookshelf here, but then it has a ping pong table and a pool table. So what's different, right? Like, why is this, do I consider this not to be my living room and the other ones to be my living room? Even my porch, same similar things, except it's outside. So I would have to explain, right? Like, what is the distinction between this room and the other rooms there? And how do I know that one is a living room and one is not? And it really comes down to, when you're explaining something, you're taking whatever that object is and you are connecting it how or why it changes or connects to something else. So think of it like, does it affect a definition? Is there an interaction? Does it interact with certain parts of the house? Is it where it changes, does it change my understanding of something else? So here, if I were to answer, and it's kind of slightly off target here, but why is that important to me that I call the living room the living room? I would say because not only is it a place where, and I'm hitting the definition here, we all sit together and play games, and we also, it has all the attributes of a living room, but I also believe it's important because, and I need to elaborate here, I can see my definition is, or my explain is not sufficient, right? We do things independently too. We're still together. I can do that in any of the other rooms. But I think probably the most important thing is that it's centrally located in the house. It's not like an offset. It's actually the first thing that you walk into. And it's supposed to be warm and welcoming. And we're really not doing anything else in that room except sitting together. It's built to be together, right? You sit on the couches, you're facing each other. It's built for communication. It's built for community. So to me, it's the primary place where we go to relax every night as a family, either together or not. And that's what makes it the living room to me. So I hope that as you see this, like, again, you're identifying, you're naming something, you can identify something in like the same sentence that you're defining, describing, or explaining something. Defining it, if we need to clarify what something means, we should define it, right? We should say, like, this is what this is. Describing is trying to take a concept that's external to our conversation and tell us what characteristics you might find, so that if I were to walk up to it, I'd be like, okay, that's what that is. And then explain, again, we're showing interaction. How does it interact? How does it connect? How does it change? How does it affect something else? Those are the ways that we know that we're accomplishing all of those different task verbs. So let's think about that as we turn into looking at last night's homework, because we're going to look at I think 3 kids' responses that I pulled from Le Twitter. So as you guys know, if you haven't seen this, pause it, read it. This is about the Federal Reserve and Republican Party platform from 2016. I'm going to move ahead. Okay, so this is a student reaction or student response that I harvested from Twitter. And I pulled this one down because I really want to show you I'd actually prefer to show you something that has some room for improvement, because sometimes when we're looking at stuff, like I told this student, I clearly can see that you understand how these things work. However, your writing requires me to make some assumptions. It requires me to draw some conclusions in terms of what you mean, which is not something that I, as the reader, should do. I should draw zero conclusions based on your writing. Because if you're leaving something unsaid or you're not specific enough, then you haven't fully demonstrated that you understand the concept. And so that is why I pulled this one down. His kid, I think, really understands it, but it was just short in completely within the four corners of this response, showing or demonstrating complete mastery. So the first thing here, again, A, describe an action. And there's the other than advancing legislation that members of Congress may take to bring transparency and accountability to the Federal Reserve. So down at the very bottom, you can see I pulled from my AP the answer key, because I want you to see what we're looking for so that you can use it to judge this response by yourself. And I would suggest pausing and reading it because I'm going to move forward. So the first thing that I see here when I'm looking at this is that the student says congressional oversight, and that is a concept that is great. I see that there's a direct connection to the content that you are supposed to master. However, oversight is an idea. It's not a concrete action. If I close my eyes and I say, what is oversight? I don't see somebody doing something because it's kind of a larger nebulous idea, right? It's just a larger overarching concept from which there are several specific things that you could do. So the reason why I have a problem with this response is that I know the kid understands it, but I have to draw conclusions in terms of exactly what that would look like. I would have a really hard time identifying oversight in action. I know that they come back and they say that it's about reviewing, monitoring, and supervising, but I don't know what's different about Congress reviewing, monitoring, and supervising versus the executive branch versus the judiciary. There needs to be a cleaner, closer word that is used, that's plugged in here, like hearings or investigation or some kind of reporting. That's a very specific action verb where I could say, yeah, like I can close my eyes and envision a hearing. It's a room, all are there, they're asking questions of people who are assembled. That's what we're looking for here. The other component, and I know they come down and say they're going to alert the Federal Reserve to make changes. So that's not a clean power, right? What does that mean? Alerting. How is that going to be done? You need to be clear. You need to be able to say, this is a specific action that they would do. It's too vague, right? I cannot close my eyes and say, I know that that is a specific thing that Congress would do. Because alerting could be like, literally, I'm going to send up smoke signals and you're going to have to interpret them, or I'm going to put a note in a carrier pigeon and send it to Congress. And I know I'm being a little dramatic here, but you have to really be concrete. And the final thing here where they do get concrete is they say cut funding to the Federal Reserve. And that is a problem because this could be a spare tire. But if we look at this, cutting funding is a key limitation that you are not allowed to talk about. They said other than advancing legislation. Legislation comes in two forms. It's either an authorization for a program to exist, or it is an appropriation of money. Either way, it takes legislation to do both, and that's what this is it's legislating. So this would not earn a point. Here's their answer for B. So in the context of this section on the Republican Party platform, again, we're like drawing back up to A, or back to the prompt, explain how the proposal to increase transparency and accountability described in A would affect the Federal Reserve's ability to make economic policy. Read the student's response, read what College Board is looking for. I'm going to move on. So here is where I would say the point is earned here, and it's a little wishy-washy language, but at least I can see between these two clauses that I've highlighted that there's some kind of political pressure, right? That that Congress deciding to do one thing is resulting in in some form of response. Remember, it can be action and it can also be inaction. So by not passing economic policy, the Federal Reserve is still like, there's still an effect that this has. And that's an important thing to look at. Sometimes the answer is no action. We talked about that yesterday with the idea of voiding laws or nullifying things, which again, that's a whole nother can of worms with nullifying. So the B point is there. And when I was looking at a lot of the work on Twitter, I saw that there was no A point because of the issue of being concrete or avoiding legislation, but there usually was a B point. So we've got this one down pat. Let's move on to C. Again, explain how ideological differences between parties might affect Democratic Party support of the proposal. Read it. I'm going to move on. Okay. So support of the proposal to me has to again terminate in some kind of concrete interaction. We're not talking about, like, we have to look at how does ideology impact the Democratic Party, impact the relationship that's had between Congress and the Federal Reserve. And they're very clear here that down in the notes that you can't just restate the prompt. Like, that's not an explain. That's not a point. So the one thing that I will say here, and that I know this student is listening, is that I love the fact that they have made a distinction between party ID and political ideology. We know, I'm seeing concrete, like I'm memorizing this, that party ID and Democratic Party are two different concepts. They're often linked, but they need to be separated. They need to be clarified. So excellent job. The issue here is that we're explaining again. So we have to explain how ideology affects parties, affects the Federal Reserve. And the student here says that this is the closest they get. They say it's increased trust and expanded power in the federal government, right? That's what it results in. That's kind of our explain. However, it's a little unclear as to what that means. I can't close my eyes and know what increased trust looks like as a result of the Federal Reserve. And we're not thinking about increased trust for the Federal Reserve. We're thinking about the effect that it has on that agency through the oversight process. So you have to give me a very clean description and explanation as to how the Federal Reserve might, as a result, interact. So we're looking for, maybe they would pay more attention to the Republican Party's efforts because they are less likely to support that idea, whereas the Democrats are more likely to support regulation that comes out of the FC or the Federal Reserve, and therefore they can kind of like ignore them a little bit. Something along those lines. Of all of the FRQs that I gave feedback on, the C point was only achieved in one. It's a harder point, right? And this is where I get to, well, actually I have a couple of conclusions that we're going to draw from this. And the first one is, and I hope you've heard this over and over again, you have to be concrete. I need to see a player. I need to see an action. I need to see both of them as they relate back to that prompt. If you are vague in any way, if you use nebulous concepts, it is increasing the likelihood that you're not going to get that point. Here's another one. So Congress can activate its public education function in order to ensure the transparency and accountability of the Federal Reserve. So that is a description. And the thing that I have here is that public education function feels a little wonky to me. I'm not quite sure what that is. Now, listen to what I say. I think, what am I doing? I'm drawing a conclusion. I think this has to do with going public, right? Using the bully pulpit for Congress to be able to do something, I think. And as soon as I, as the reader, have to think at all, then the point hasn't been achieved. I shouldn't have to draw any conclusions or complete the student's thoughts, because if I am, then they're not doing sufficient work. Members can organize public hearings. This is great, right? They're organizing, this would be our explain, that they're organizing public hearings in order to update and fulfill. And here's where they go off track, because there's so few words here. What are they fulfilling? They're not fulfilling the specific things. I don't see a clear enough connection back to the prompt. They're talking about the Republican Party platform. Well, what part of the Republican Party platform? Is it the Build a Wall part of the Republican Party platform? Or is it the Federal Reserve regulation? You have to clarify, right? And I like that they say the legal needs, but that's not a legal need, that's a policy desire. So I know that I'm like quibbling over wording here, but when I'm looking at this, there's so many points in A where the student is either unclear or doesn't get close enough to the prompt that I understand what they're saying. I have to draw conclusions, and therefore the point cannot be awarded. So you really want to make sure that you are tying everything up in a nice, neat package with a beautiful bow on the top, and the reader can just walk through it and go, okay, yeah, I get what you're saying. I know exactly what you're talking about. The B point, the Federal Reserve will have a harder time making economic policy because public hearings will then hold the bureaucracy accountable for monetary policy decisions regarding the distribution of money. The federal, I love it. That's a great description, right? You're telling me the process. Beautiful. Here is our reasoning, right? This is our commentary. This is our explain point. The Federal Reserve would have to allot time and resources into the preparation of public hearings. A little bit off of where I would expect it to go, but we're seeing here is that it's having a negative impact somehow. Congress or the Federal Reserve is having to adjust the way in which they do something because of the oversight function referenced above, which didn't work. Now, key thing here, remember A and B are not connected, so you can miss A and still get B. And they do. I give them the B point there. C is where I, again, fall into this issue of a little unclear, a little vague. So though the Democratic Party as a whole would likely be in support of the proposal, Democrats wouldn't prioritize the notion given ideological differences. The party would be in support of the proposal. Again, like I need to see a stronger, like pull out more specific detail from the proposal. I need to see something where I can tell which of the prompts are we talking about, right? Are you talking about the Federal Reserve? Are you talking about whatever? So pull language that's out of there. The party would be in support of the proposal because it ensures closure to the people. Again, we're focusing more on the effect that it has on the ideology of individual peoples and the voting public. And you're supposed to be talking to me about how this affects the relationship between Congress and the Federal Reserve. So if we're not talking about Congress and the Federal Reserve, then we're not answering the question. And so this too is a 1 out of 3. Here is the one that I saw that was a 3. Really great, great description in A, turns into a fantastic explanation. Very, very good, very succinct. Same thing with B, same thing with C. The point was that the Federal Reserve is already opposed by conservative beliefs as they believe in free market economy, great connection back to ideology. So due to these differences, the Republicans would, I'm skipping ahead, would increase transparency and accountability. So we see an interaction and we see a response from the Federal Reserve as it relates to both the Democrats and the Republicans. And so to me, this is a 3. Like it could be a little bit cleaner, but I see actions being taken by the Federal Reserve as it relates back to both of those parties, and it's clean enough. So takeaway from this one, write the whole 15 minutes. The more you write on the paper, the more likely you are to do well. Oh my God, it's 3:30. Holy cow. So I think I'm going to skip our writing FRQ today because I have to get through the content. Geez, Louise, I stretched out inside of that prompt. Okay, so quickly, judicial review powers. When we say judicial powers, we're talking about this idea of negating, right? That goes back to, and it actually was in existence in inside of the conversation about the ratification of the US Constitution at the time. So the conversations that were being had, and I have this quote here from Oliver Ellsworth in the Connecticut Ratification Convention, because in honesty, I got to tell you that when we're trying to understand how the founding fathers, which is an amorphous group of diverse opinions where they didn't agree. Remember, North Carolina, Rhode Island, North Carolina said no, Rhode Island refused to ratify, that they are having a conversation in which we have different opinions. And it's the conversations that are had in the ratification conventions that really help us understand what the Constitution means. You read Federalist, you've read, or you kind of get some, we've talked a lot about like things that happen in the conventions. but the convention information was not publicly distributed. It wasn't available until after James Madison dies. And so for that reason, when we're going back to try to illuminate what the founding fathers thought, we go to the conversation being had in the press, the out of doors conversation that's being had in the press in the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist debates, and we go to the indoors conversations that are being had at the ratification convention. That helps us understand what the common perception was, realizing that there's going to be people on the fringes who agree or disagree for various reasons. So here he's talking about, he's showing that he understands, and it's a common perception, that the idea of judiciary going through and voiding acts of Congress was a rational expectation that almost everyone had. They said, okay, we understand they're going to come through, they're going to passively negate laws that might be out of sync with what the Constitution says. And so that wasn't terribly radical. And I love this quote from Randy Barnett, and I have the link down below, where he says originalism and this idea of how we interpret it. And originalism, if you talk to somebody who's an originalist, which to some degree is people like Justice Antonin Scalia, Justice Thomas, Clarence Thomas, those folks, they tend to look to what the founding fathers said, what the Constitution says, what the facts of the case are, and what the standing precedent is. And that's really it. They're not looking beyond that. So originalism as a philosophy of how to interpret the Constitution is based on facts of the Constitution as an effort to place rules and restrictions on lawmakers and enforcers, that the Constitution was put in writing to better preserve the restrictions. What restrictions are we talking about? Checks and balances, separation of powers, the Madisonian system of government. That purpose for putting these restrictions in writing would largely vanish if lawmakers or judges could change the rules by which laws were made. Hence, originalism is justified because we, right here and right now, are or profess to be committed to a written constitution. And the meaning of the written constitution should remain in the same until it is properly changed. You know how that's happening, right? Formally through amendments, and then informally through party action, elections, all that stuff. This last proposition is all that original meaning and originalism amounts to. So if we're trying to think of like different ways of interpreting, this is a really great kind of succinct way of pulling this together. However, this is not where we have gone. And this is a quote that continues, I believe I should have highlighted it and put the quote in here, but I'm pretty sure this is a continuation of Mr. Barnett's work, that we have gone beyond our original understandings of what judicial review means. So today we've seen that more power has come into play, and that the court's not just passively saying that's unconstitutional. The courts are actually playing a larger role in deciding not only what the Constitution does, what the Constitution says, but what it doesn't mean, or when it's not clear. So he's going to go on to say this idea of judicial nullification, or just saying laws don't exist, would extend to refusing to hold a person liable for disobeying an unconstitutional command of the Constitution. Nullification, however, does not include the further power to order or mandate that someone act in a particular manner, or to desist from acting in a manner if the court finds it to be unconstitutional. Whether or not this additional power can be justified on the basis of interpretation or construction is a separate question. While historical evidence strongly supports the conclusion that the original meaning of judicial power included the power to nullify, there is little, if any, evidence to support the idea that original meaning of judicial power included the power to command other branches. So that is Mr. Barnett's work. Very important. I mean, that should be like, let's work through why that's so radical. The courts today use judicial review in a much more active sense. Now, again, the courts can't enforce anything, but they do have maneuvers in place that create an incredible amount of pressure to get people to respond. So think of Brown v. Board, right? Brown v. Board set off this intense political pressure that once the courts rubber stamped it and said separation of segregation in education is inherently unequal and therefore cannot stand, we have to get rid of Plessy v. Ferguson, they're creating an environment that's going to give constituents, people, special interest groups, increased power to persuade, to the point where Eisenhower had to nationalize the National Guard to desegregate the Little Rock High School. That is something that is well beyond just nullifying an action. If you go on beyond that, especially when we're thinking about desegregation of schools, the courts are going to take on an even more powerful perspective, which is that they get to come in and they get to use things like injunctions, where they're actually making commands, or in some places they're mandating like judicially observed or regulated desegregation of schools, where the courts are taking an active role in getting schools to, use busing and other things like this. So we truly have walked into a time period where the courts and their powers that they have real world political issues that should be taken into consideration, and are for whatever reason incongruent with the original understanding. And I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing. Value judgments are not what we're talking about here. How do they get that way? Here we're looking at the independence of the judiciary, some decisions that have been, some patterns of decisions that have been made by the courts, things that go back to John Marshall, right, who has looked at one of the greatest chief justices, his decision to turn from individual justices writing individual decisions, which means that politicians can pick them off and pair them against each other. He said, you know what we should do to protect ourselves and our independence? We need to make a majority opinion where one person is writing and there's only one interpretation, unless you are in a concurring opinion or a dissenting opinion. The bureaucracy, the development of a bureaucracy to assist the courts in all of the functions that they have, including having clerks and things like this that we have today, and court tradition. These are all really important things that have helped the courts kind of develop this power that they use. Another really important thing, stare decisis, let the previous decision stand. We love to use our previous decisions that are similar to cases to help increase predictability, right? It also decreases the amount of work that the Supreme Court has to do in kind of sussing out what's the correct interpretation. Because once a decision, particularly by the Supreme Court, has been made, they can say to the lower courts, to the Court of Appeals, hey, use this as a guide. Now, I want to say really quickly that if you're having a hard time with the difference between a court of original jurisdiction and an appellate court, down in the links, I posted a video that I created for my own students a couple of years ago. So you're going to hear me talking like not to the nation, but to the students in my classroom. But it talks about how courts matriculate through the system. And I just thought I would share that with you to help you pull that stuff together. All right, so the other thing is informal evolution of interactions, delegating authority via law, appointments and confirmation. All of these things help change those relationships. So when we get into other terms that are frequently thrown around, judicial restraint versus judicial activism, you probably talked about this in class. We think of judicial restraint as people who are very closely applying the standards that are found in the Constitution, standing law, precedent, and facts of the case, whereas judicial activists, we commonly hear it used to describe people who are kind of using their power broadly to expand their own powers. Now, I'm going to tell you for a minute that there's a little bit of some misunderstanding in terms of how these terms are used. We have some shaky definitions that I want to clarify a little bit here. And one of them is that the critics of the court are often going to accuse justices who pen controversial decisions as judicial activism. And judicial activism is a term that the justices themselves don't use. Like, they don't walk around and go, you're being a judicial activist here. And actually, I'm going to say, like, I'm going to give a shout out. If you're looking for, I can post, there's a really great episode from a podcast that I listened to called Your Weekly Constitutional that does a great job at breaking this down in further detail. So I'll post that in the comments. Okay, so the term that we use is that, I want you to think about this, is that it can be used for quote unquote liberal judges and quote unquote conservative judges equally. I look at the cases Obergefell v. Hodges and I see it's a liberal decision that is being handed down through judicial activism, right? It's a case that reinterpreted relations between state and federal government. It's also a case that is going to expand the right to marriage to gay couples. So this is something that you would hear people say, oh, that's judicially activist, because there's really no standard precedent that expands marriage to LGBTQ. We're taking more powers to the central government, so on and so forth. All right, although I will say Loving v. Virginia exists and, whatever. But I digress. Conservatives can also hand down decisions that are going to radically reinterpret, that are going to break with stare decisis and precedent, that are going to create new fields of law. And McDonald v. Chicago, again, a federalism case that just so happens to deal with your right to guns, is a fantastic example of that, because McDonald v. Chicago is for the first time really going to radically change the way that we understand the Second Amendment, of whether or not the right of the individual to hold arms, or it's the right of the state to regulate that for the purposes of self-protection from an abusive central government's army. That's a really critically important thing. And yes, I should say that DC v. Heller preceded it a little bit, and it's an important precedent. So really those two in conjunction are examples of potentially judicial activism. So it can be used to describe a justice, but we should probably stick it to it's a decision, right? We're looking at individual decisions and how that justice or how the court voted is a better way of describing judicial activism and judicial restraint. So what do judges consider? We already talked about this. The history, right? We're looking at what would the founding fathers do. You're looking at the text of the Constitution, common understandings of the words at the time. You're looking at the structural, we're looking at legal rules and so on and so forth, and then precedents. So these four things, all justices consider, It's when you have somebody who routinely is going to look beyond what the founding fathers said, or maybe they put more weight into the fact that the founding fathers either A, didn't have consensus on an issue, or B, couldn't have possibly found consensus because this issue didn't exist at the time. They will look at ethical and prudential concerns as well. So ethical looks to morality, right? Like, how should we look at this in a time period today? If we are thinking about the morality of the time, how would we construct that in modern terms? And then prudential has to do with cost benefit analysis. How is this going to, what's the impact that this is going to have on the community? Another fantastic video that I posted for you down below in the description is a debate between Scalia and Breyer, and they are on opposite ends. They have their own terminology for what they describe their judicial philosophy to be, and they are going to spar. My kids always love watching this. There's a couple of exchanges that always make them chuckle. It's a really great video, so check both of those out. Okay, so what do we infer from this? That decisions handed down by courts have political implications that make the job of influencing justices very important. Remember, we saw this. We understand that presidents care a ton about courts. We talked yesterday about the idea that Trump, whether or not he can close down the Senate so that he can get recess appointments put into the courts that benefit him politically. We've seen that the idea of confirming judges, we've seen more, like there's more political partisan kind of like sparring going on here, that the total no votes as of March 6, 2018 was higher for Trump than it had been for previous presidents. And there's some interesting kind of like issues there that really get into the quality of the justices that are being presented and the concerns that the Senate Judiciary Committee members have in terms of their ability to be able to maintain such an important elevated position in a term of good behavior. This is a really fun picture here. It comes, and I have the quote down or the citation later in the slideshow, but I really love this because this is like spaghetti on the wall. I think this helps us visualize something. If we're looking at trends versus patterns, here's a pattern that I see. And if you like want time to sit and think about this, then please do pause it. But when I look at this, I see spaghetti thrown against the wall, and all of that spaghetti has a tendency, I hope I do this right, to go down over time. And what is down? Down is liberal. So this tells us is that the longer a justice is, statistically speaking, right, based on this Martin Quinn measurement, which has its own issues, and you can read into some of the criticisms of the Martin Quinn methodology has, and they're important, but generally speaking, this shows us that if we were just to assign a decision positive or negative, the votes for each justice is positive or negative, positive meaning conservative, negative meaning liberal. We see a tendency for them to get more liberal over time, which means that there is a political prize to be had in appointing these people to the court. And so where do we see influence? We see it in the appointment and confirmation, and then we see it in petitioning for the writ of certiorari. We see it in the briefs and oral arguments, when that's like the whole point, is that you're there to influence the outcome, although I'll get maybe to that in a minute. And then the other thing is the amicus briefs. Amicus briefs coming from means friends of the court. So that can be special interest groups, it can be the government, it can be private individuals. You can write an amicus brief if you wanted to. You just got to find a lawyer who can submit it for you. So this comes from, the nomination and the advise and consent component. We know this, right? This is going through some of the ideology, and you can pause this here. This comes from Federalist 76. This is Hamilton talking about why he thinks it's so important for this to be something that's separated from the people, and it has to do with, I'm going to move ahead because I'm running out of time, that this is such an important position of being able to kind of void laws in his mind, that we need to have the collective input from individuals to help us select people who are well qualified for this. And he doesn't want it to be related to democratic ways. Again, we know why, because he is concerned about the demagoguery of democracy. We can see patterns. So I'm going to say thank you to my friends at Street Law. They are amazing. I am obsessed with them. Teachers, if you've never been to Street Law's material or done Street Law's summer things, please look them up. They are fabulous. They treat you well. You learn so much. This is from their work this past summer when I attended their conference. I want you to see that there's these amazing patterns here, right? That really we should suss out. We see that there's a distinct difference between conservative presidents and the types of individuals that they are appointing versus liberal. And again, if we're thinking why, let's draw some conclusions from this data. We know that there are associations between demographic information and someone's political party affiliation. So we can see that you have a tendency, what's our drawn conclusion here? What's our pattern? Conservatives tend to appoint more white males, and we see that liberals tend to appoint less. And the reason why is because of the overlap, the association between party affiliation, political ideology, and then gender and sex. So amici is a different thing here, and I want to make sure that I fly through this really quickly. There's also some interesting stuff here. The standard perspective is that we just look at these amici briefs, the amicus briefs, as just like, I'm going to write something that's going to tell you how I feel about this policy position, and the court may or may not read it. But in a nuanced perspective, and actually, I will also want to give a shout out to my friend Wesley Hottot, who works for Institutes for Justice, or IJ. I hope I got the I part right. Probably didn't. That's fine. Who has been into my classroom and talked to my students. He was the lawyer who successfully argued Timms v. Indiana, which is a selective incorporation case. And he talked a ton about how this whole thing with amici is so much more interesting than we get into the books. Like, it's a whole thing, right? Your top-notch lawyers today, they're there shaping the court's docket. That's the list of cases that they're going to hear. They actively go out and they say, hey, I'm going in front of the Supreme Court. You're a really important person. The court knows you. They respect you. Can you guys write an amicus brief for me? And here's what I would want you to say. And they also are going to curate that list of people, the voices that are presented to the Supreme Court, so that unusual or interesting things might show up. And you even sometimes say, one of the things that Wesley shared with us was that the most interesting amicus brief that he had was from the NAACP. And they went ahead and they said, we want you to hear this case. And then they pivoted to another case that they wanted the court to hear that had similar implications that they wanted them to consider for the following year's term. And it ended up that they did. So we have this really fascinating, it's a passive conversation that's being had out of doors, that's publicly available. But the whole thing is, it's not like behind closed doors. It's not this like, like whining and dining type of thing. It's these long-winded legal explanations as to why the court should consider this issue, why it's important. They're looking at each individual justice. They're writing the amicus briefs that are tailored to the needs and the interests of each individual justice. They're trying to construct an argument that they know that that person would be like, oh yeah, that's something that I love. And we know that the amicus briefs get cited in the conclusions and the holdings that they give. So a lot of us have this expectation that like amicus is just passive. No, there's like really cool conversations that are being had. And it's what's fun about it is that it's something that you get to read and you get to understand it just like a Supreme Court justice would, because they're not having these private hush hush conversations where they're like, oh, let's decide it for this, right? So these Supreme Court lawyers, they're good advocates, but they're also coordinating their amici to get some kind of cool perspective out of it. They're looking to tailor it to law clerks' interests, so on and so forth, because the law clerks there's a clerk pool, and they're out there helping kind of prune the list of the number of cases that come to them and they create briefs that the court justices will use to make a decision of whether or not they will eventually end up voting for the rule to hear that case. And we know that they need the rule of 4 in order for that to happen. So, just to kind of give you a perspective on how this happens, on how people are trying to kind of curate that cool list of amici briefs, here's an example. You see kind of like all of this stuff coming from all these different cool places where you see a lot of the same heavy hitters. If you really want to have a fun time, I know that this is one of my my fourth period's favorite thing to do was the day we talked about amicus briefs and the impact. They had a ton of fun researching David Boyle. And yeah, you can go ahead and check that out too. It's kind of a little Easter egg. So I'm going to skip past this and I'm going to save this FRQ for next time because we're running out of time. I feel like I can at least say that we spent a ton of time going through student responses and that you guys probably have a better understanding of reading other students' responses and hear me grade them than me going through and practicing each one. So let's do our questions. Number 1, in Baker v. Carr, the Supreme Court ruled that a state legislature would have to redraw the representative districts in order to comply with the Constitution. Which of the following potential difficulties could have resulted from this discussion? A, the state legislature could have refused to implement the decision. B, the U.S. Congress could have requested funding be cut off from the redistricting program. Not that one. C, the district could have created an executive agreement, or the president, sorry, could have created an executive agreement. And D, the state appellate court could have issued a ruling. I feel like the answer is jumping off the page. It should be A, right? All the other stuff you should be like, no, that's not possible. You can't do that, because you can. All right. Question 2, in the case of Wickard v. Filburn, Roscoe Filburn was penalized for producing 12 acres of wheat above his allotment under the AAA of 1938. The law, justified under Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce, limited the amount of wheat an individual could grow. This regulation would keep prices from dropping and prevent farmers from going bankrupt. Filburn claimed the excess wheat was for his own use and challenged the use of the interstate commerce. Supreme Court ruled the Commerce Clause allowed the government to regulate Filburn's personal wheat production, even though it was indirectly related to interstate commerce. Which of the following which of the following was a likely result of the Wickard-Filburn that contributed to the court's later decision in U.S. v. Lopez? I love this question. It's so hard. Oh my gosh. Look at it. Think about it. A, the Supreme Court's not elected, so unpopular decisions in the Wickard case cannot be overturned unless Congress acts upon it. B, laws passed by Congress have since undergone judicial review by the Supreme Court to ensure that the Commerce Clause and other parts of the Constitution are interpreted correctly. C, expansive interpretation of Commerce Clause by Supreme Court, which greatly extended the power of Congress, drew criticism and eventually led to a more narrow interpretation. D, rather than be regulated by Congress, many citizens and corporations opt to find loopholes. That makes me laugh, so that the law doesn't apply to them. It is C, right? We're looking here at kind of like influencing things that come out of Congress later. We did it all with the exception of me running through that sample. I hope you forgive me. I'll get it next Monday, I promise. Here is your homework. I look forward to you guys giving this a try. Continue to give each other feedback. You guys are doing an amazing job. Engage each other, have conversations, be the adults that you are, right? Let's have sophisticated, evidence-based drawing of conclusions and conversations about all the things that are happening. And the final thing, here are my list of all the things that I referred to. Thank you again to Street Law. You guys are amazing. And I'm going to say, have a great weekend. Go out and take a walk if you can, or trudge through the snow if you live up in Connecticut and Rhode Island. And if you live in the American Southwest, it's hot down there. Enjoy. We'll see you on Monday.